A Florida couple were arrested in Marion County in the summer of 2023 for running an operation in which they bonded women out of jail only to then force them to become escorts. 34-year-old Joselito Martinez and Tanya Worcester, aged 30, offered at least 3 women housing before their true intentions were revealed. The victims were held captive in subservience and advertised online for commercial intercourse. The acts took place at various locations throughout Central Florida, and the couple kept all the proceeds. Martinez and Worcester had a child together, who was reportedly sometimes in the home when the escort services occurred. The authorities theorized that between 2019 and 2021, Martinez and Worcester made roughly $300,000 from the operation to subdue the reluctant escorts. Martinez resorted to drugs, threats, and subjecting them to humiliating acts, such as shaving their heads. At least 2 of the victims were forced to get tattoos that branded them his property. State records indicated that in the past, Martinez had served 3 years in prison for organized fraud of $50,000 or more, while Worcester was locked up for 18 months for conspiracy to commit the same crime. Following their most recent arrest, the couple were charged with human trafficking and booked into the Orange County Jail. Number 6. Monty Lavelle Chitty. Florida pastor Monty Lavelle Chitty was arrested on multiple abuse-related charges in the spring of 2024 after preying on a teenage member of his congregation. 62-year-old Chitty, who served as the leader of the First Baptist of Marathon, was reported to law enforcement by an anonymous caller who'd overheard the victim telling an adult she'd been abused. Investigators talked to the victim, who said that Chitty had given her a vodka drink which she believed was spiked. Afterwards, she felt weak, could not walk, and eventually lost consciousness while at the church. She woke up on a couch as Chitty was performing an oral act on her. The teen ran out and called her grandma to come pick her up. The authorities discovered revolting messages which the pastor sent the victim after abusing her. In one, he complimented her genitals, and in another he wrote, "I prefer you pass out after I play, not before." Chitty, a married man, also wrote that she should just say thank you. In the assault's immediate aftermath, the pastor tried to get ahead of his accuser. He called deputies to say that he'd intended to take the girl to her grandmother's house while delivering meals to the homeless. He claimed that upon seeing her drunk, he allowed her to sleep on a couch in the church library but denied touching her beyond helping her lie down. Chitty invoked the right of attorney once he was confronted with the incriminating messages. He was released on a $75,000 bond and shortly thereafter fled the state. In April, he was arrested in Woodville, Texas, after he approached a church group working with the homeless, and the member recognized him as a wanted man. The case was ongoing as of the latest updates, and Chitty was charged with battery of a minor, lewd and lascivious conduct, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Number 5. Christopher Hawkins. From 2013 to 2019, dating app swindler Christopher Hawkins used manipulation, threats, coercive control, and violence to victimize at least 10 women across Scotland. He portrayed himself as a successful businessman, gained their trust, and convinced each of them that they were in a loving and exclusive relationship. Hawkins then used various ploys to con them into sending him money, most commonly by faking banking issues. He also sent the women screenshots of various destinations and persuaded them to send him half payments for holidays, on which they'd presumably go together. The trips never materialized, and Hawkins kept their money. Scotland's Domestic Abuse Task Force started investigating the man in the fall of 2019, and he was eventually arrested. In January of 2024, Hawkins pleaded guilty to 11 fraud charges at the High Court in Glasgow. In total, he'd swindled roughly £214,000 out of the victims, almost none of which was repaid. Some of the women spent all their savings on him and were left in financial ruin. Hawkins used the ill-gotten money to fund his lavish lifestyle and gambling addiction. In May of 2024, he was found guilty of additional charges, including forcing himself on one of the women as she slept and video recording 2 others in private situations without their consent before sending them the explicit content. a judge determined that Hawkins remorselessly left a trail of emotional devastation and financial distress in his wake. The 37-year-old was handed a 12-year sentence and issued indefinite non-harassment orders for his victims, in addition to being ordered to register as an offender indefinitely. Number 4. Ola May Age. In November of 2010, a Florida woman made headlines after she became one of the oldest people in the US to be convicted of selling cocaine. 87-year-old Ola May Age was caught in the spring of that year following a drug sting. CCTV showed an undercover officer knocking on the back door of her Pensacola home on April the 30th. The unassuming pensioner was reported to have reached behind her couch and produced a small amount of crack cocaine, which the officer bought for $15. She was arrested, and given all the evidence, it took a jury less than 15 minutes to find her guilty of 1 count of selling cocaine. Age was jailed for 18 months in the fall of 2010, meaning that she would be almost 90 years old when released. The woman had a history of drug offenses going back to the mid-1990s. In December of 1996, she pleaded no contest to possession of a controlled substance with intent to sell, manufacture, or deliver. She was given 2 years probation, which ended when she was in her late 70s. Less than a year later, Age was once again arrested and charged with possession of cocaine with intent to distribute. Number 3. Leonard Angel. On January the 21st of 2022, Leonard Angel befriended a 51-year-old man over drinks at a bar on the Strand in central London, England. They spent roughly 2 hours together and then left the establishment. 32-year-old Angel convinced the other man to walk with him down a dark side street towards the Embankment tube station. CCTV captured them walking together, with the older man appearing to be unsteady on his feet. When they were alone without warning or provocation, Angel punched him in the face. He then placed him in a chokehold, dragged him to the ground, and continued striking him. It would emerge that throughout the night, Angel had planned to steal the victim's £145,000 Patek Philippe watch. After beating him into unconsciousness, he took the luxury watch off his wrist and fled. When a member of the public found the victim, he'd been out cold for several minutes. The attack left him with severe facial fractures and psychological trauma. Law enforcement identified Angel from the CCTV footage and tracked him down to a Houston Road hotel the following month. The police learned that a few days after the attack, he rented a secure lockup. From it, officers recovered a large amount of cash. In the late fall of 2022, Angel was found guilty of robbery and possessing criminal property at Southwark Crown Court. He was jailed for over 9 years. Today's topic was requested by Curtis Whitehead Jr. 1322 and Cali Girl Living in Nevada 8. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Dana Sue Gray. In less than a month in 1994, American serial killer Dana Sue Gray claimed multiple elderly victims, spreading terror within the gated community of Canyon Lake in Riverside, California. The woman, who was at the time in her late 30s, conjured up pretexts to approach her vulnerable victims before ambushing them. Her first suspected victim was 86-year-old Norma Davis. She was the mother-in-law of Jerry Ambrust, nee Davis, the woman who'd married Gray's father a few years prior. In mid-February, a neighbor found the elderly victim 2 days after she was killed, with a utility knife sticking out of her neck and a fillet knife lodged in her chest. There were no signs of struggle or forced entry, indicating that Davis knew her killer. At the end of February, Gray went to the home of 66-year-old June Roberts, claiming that she wanted to borrow a book. As the woman looked for it, Gray fatally strangled her with a phone cord. The killer then stole 2 of Roberts' credit cards and went on a shopping spree. The murders caused a panic in the community, leading to elderly widows sleeping in groups at designated houses. A few of the residents came to believe that the violent incidents were ritual sacrifices carried out by a cult. Investigators initially faced such difficulty in identifying suspects that they even considered using a psychic. On March the 10th, Gray went to an antique store where Dorinda Hawkins, a woman in her late 50s, was working alone. Gray claimed that she wanted to buy a photo frame, and when Hawkins was distracted, she wrapped a phone cord around her neck and applied pressure. She then robbed the victim and the register before going on yet another shopping spree. Hawkins, who was younger than Gray's previous victims, survived and was able to provide detectives with a description of her. Jerry Ambrust also told the lead investigator on the case that she'd come to suspect her stepdaughter of being Davis's murderer. Reports from the various Temecula area merchants who'd interacted with Gray while she was on her fraudulent shopping sprees provided additional descriptions. Once she was identified, the police started following her, but the surveillance began hours after she'd claimed her third victim. On March the 16th, shortly after 87-year-old Dora Beebe had returned home from a doctor's appointment, Gray knocked on her door asking for directions. Beebe invited her inside her home to look at a map, at which point Gray killed her. Like with the other victims, she stole her credit card. Gray was arrested the following day while she was cooking a meal for her family, and the search of her home produced vital information belonging to Beebe, Roberts and Hawkins. Gray initially maintained her innocence, claiming she'd found the victims' bank cards. When that didn't work, she opted for the insanity plea. Faced with a significant amount of circumstantial evidence and with the looming threat of the death penalty, she struck a deal with the authorities. On September the 9th of 1998, she admitted to robbing and murdering 2 women and attempting to murder a third. As a part of the deal, she wasn't prosecuted for Davis's murder and was sentenced to life without parole. If you thought these atrocious imposters weren't disturbing enough, just wait till you see what it's like to live with an actual demon next to you in our previous release of When Living with a Monster Goes Wrong. Coming up right after number 1. Number 1. Ben Field. At some point in 2011, English author and former teacher Peter Farquhar was befriended by his former student, Ben Field, who was a voluntary church warden at Stowe Parish Church. Farquhar was reportedly conflicted about being gay, which he regarded as incompatible with his Anglican faith. Field took advantage of the older man's various vulnerabilities to charm his way into his life. They became romantically involved and underwent a betrothal ceremony in 2014. Throughout their relationship, Field carried out a systemic gaslighting of Farquhar, aimed at making him question his sanity. Field spiked his drinks and food with bioethanol poteen, benzodiazepines and hallucinogens. He moved things around his lover's house and generally tried to confuse him. Farquhar was tormented by what he believed was a mystery illness, but Field told health workers that he probably had dementia, describing him as a frequent faller. The retired teacher would indeed often collapse around the house, and one photo showed him with a black eye. He'd suffered from a fall. In reality, his symptoms didn't stem from a medical condition, but from Field drugging him. Oblivious to the latter's hidden agenda, Farquhar trusted him fully and made him the main beneficiary of his will. On October the 26th of 2015, Farquhar was found dead by his cleaner with a half-empty bottle of whiskey next to his body. No foul play was initially suspected, and many, including the coroner, believed that the troubled 69-year-old had drunk himself to death. The cause of death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning. Through his late partner, Field had met retired head teacher Anne Moore Martin, who lived a few doors down. She, like Farquhar, was an avid churchgoer who was lonely and mostly kept to herself. Field seduced Moore Martin, and they became romantically involved. Her sister-in-law said that the woman was fully under the young man's spell and acted like a love-struck teenager. Field, however, would cruelly and remorselessly deceive and manipulate her. He at one point gave her a framed photo of himself under which the words, "I am always with you," were written in capitals. He left messages on her mirror and manipulated her into believing they were from God. One of them allegedly read, "Pray for Ben. Ben loves you." Field conned Moore Martin out of over £30,000, with the bulk of that money going towards a dialysis machine which he falsely claimed his younger brother needed. The woman changed her will to make Field the main beneficiary before she suffered a seizure and was hospitalized in February of 2017. When her niece visited her, the 83-year-old confided in her about the relationship with Field and the supposed divine messages on her mirrors. The police became involved and launched an investigation, also discovering Field's connection with Farquhar. Moore Martin reverted her will and cut Field out before she died from natural causes in May of 2017. The conman was arrested in January of the following year, and while sitting in the back of a police vehicle reportedly told officers, "I think I will get away with most of it." Psychiatrists that diagnosed him after the arrest determined he suffered from narcissistic personality disorder or psychopathic personality disorder. 19 months after Farquhar's death, a decision was made to exhume his body. A second post-mortem revealed that there were sedatives in his system and considerably less alcohol than initially thought. Field pleaded guilty to charges of fraud and burglary against the two victims, but denied any involvement in their deaths. He was acquitted of the attempted murder of Moore Martin, but found guilty of Farquhar's murder. Prosecutors successfully argued that Field had sedated him and suffocated him when he was too weak to fight back before planting the whiskey bottle next to the body. 28-year-old Field was jailed for life with a minimum of 36 years behind bars in 2019 and lost all of his subsequent appeals. The case was the basis for a number of documentaries and inspired a 2023 BBC TV miniseries called The Sixth Commandment, with actor Iana Hardwick playing Field. Leading up to his 2013 arrest, Welshman Craig Thomas had subjected his partner Charlotte Rooks to a campaign of torment that eventually led to media outlets labeling him the worst ever abuser in British history. Rooks spoke of countless incidents of deranged violence that included Thomas hitting her in the head with hammers, stabbing her in the back, or making her sleep naked standing up. He would place Rooks into what she described as the crucifixion pose as he beat and forced himself on her for days on end. Rooks twice tried to escape him but returned after Thomas threatened to kill her family. At one point, he took her by force from a hospital where she was getting treatment for her injuries and threatened to abuse and kill her dying grandmother, who was at the same medical facility. South Wales police issued a sincere apology to the woman after a 2018 report from the Independent Police Complaints Commission found multiple failings by South Wales officers of rescuing Rooks from her abuser. The police made multiple visits to the couple's home, but had failed to grasp the severity of the situation. In one incident, when Rooks was pregnant, Thomas hit her in the stomach with the metal pipe extension of a vacuum cleaner, threatening to beat the baby out. A member of the public saw the assault through the window of their Cardiff apartment and alerted law enforcement. 4 officers arrived at the home but believed Thomas when he said the call was fake, failing to identify recent injuries to Rooks's face as a sign of abuse. Once the police were gone, Thomas took out his frustration over the call on his partner. He trapped her arms under a sofa and relentlessly stomped on her stomach. At one point, he made her choose how she wanted to die, whether by drinking bleach or having a bag placed over her head. Thomas was eventually arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison at Cardiff Crown Court. When Rooks made her story public, she said that Thomas had nearly killed her, adding, "My injuries are life-changing. I have a bulging blood vessel in my brain. Even now that could rupture and kill me." The woman also publicly voiced her concerns in July of 2023 when Thomas was released upon completing his sentence. After nearly a decade, Rooks still feared that he would find her and kill her. Number 7. Mary Beth Finke. The authorities in Peoria, Arizona, were called to a home near North El Mirage Road in April of 2023. The caller was an elderly man whose identity wasn't revealed and who told the police that he'd been severely beaten by his wife and primary caregiver, 71-year-old Mary Beth Finke. The man had to use a walker and a wheelchair due to various medical conditions that rendered him partially disabled. The incident had begun after a heavily intoxicated Finke had collapsed near the front door of their home. The woman's spouse tried to help her to her feet, at which point Finke started yelling that she was tired of taking care of him. When the man returned to his chair in the living room, Finke charged him with a 5-pound, 3-foot-long barbell and started striking him in the head and face. The disabled man sustained several hits before he was able to get away and call 911. Finke fled upon hearing him make the call but was located shortly by responding officers. Court documents indicated that the woman was arrested on suspicion of abusing a vulnerable adult, aggravated assault, and aggravated assault with a deadly instrument. Number 6. Richard David Schlosser. In early January of 2018, Richard David Schlosser launched a vicious attack on his newlywed wife at their home in Newport Beach, California. Over the course of several hours from January the 5th to the 6th, 36-year-old Schlosser tormented the victim, who was only identified as being 65 years old. The man punched and kicked her, hit her with a candelabrum, and cut her with scissors. Schlosser, who was at the time under the influence of drugs and alcohol, held his wife captive for at least 6 hours, during which he was reported to have waterboarded, choked her, and shoved a towel down her throat. When Schlosser began to sober up, the victim was able to call a friend, who alerted law enforcement. Schlosser was arrested on charges of torture, criminal threats, false imprisonment, and corporal injury of a spouse. His wife was taken to a local hospital where she started recovering. In the fall of 2018, Schlosser pleaded guilty to 6 felony charges in a deal that saw the torture charge dropped. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. At the time of the attack on his wife, he was out on $50,000 bail for a separate 2016 domestic violence case in Riverside County, in which he was accused of false imprisonment, inflicting corporal injury, assault with a deadly weapon, and criminal threats against a woman in her 20s. He pleaded not guilty in that case, and as of the latest updates, his trial on the matter was pending. Number 5. Peter Lien. In July of 2012, Stephanie Lien went into a section of Bosley Rental and Supply in Jackson County, West Virginia, while her husband Peter was in a different part of the store. Stephanie told a worker, "I'm trying to get away from my husband. I just need to hide for a few minutes." The staff member noted that the woman was limping from an unspecified injury. She was gaunt, and although her clothing was clean, she smelled badly. Stephanie refused to have the authorities called but accepted help towards reaching a domestic violence shelter. Officials at the shelter described the woman as filthy and emaciated. Her feet were mutilated and swollen. She had a mark in the shape of a clothes iron on her breast, and her back was covered in scars and burns. Stephanie told officials that for nearly a decade, since the couple had moved from Maryland to West Virginia, her husband had treated her like a slave. Some aspects of her torment reportedly involved being made to kneel before Peter whenever he entered a room and being shackled to a bed. She'd reportedly given birth to a stillborn baby while in shackles, which her husband then buried on their farm. Stephanie's injuries were documented at the shelter and produced at least 45 photos depicting gruesome abuse. The authorities conducted a search of the Liens' Leroy farm and arrested Peter on July the 5th of 2012, although prosecutors argued that it was evident the scars had been inflicted via abuse. The domestic violence charges against Peter were dropped in 2013, partially due to the fact that Stephanie had refused to cooperate with the authorities and denied the allegations. Stephanie claimed that the injuries to her feet had occurred following a farming accident and explained the burns as accidental contact with her husband while he was holding a frying pan. Updates indicated that the couple's relationship had ended and Peter subsequently remarried. In March of 2020, he was arrested for kidnapping and malicious wounding following an incident with his wife whose identity wasn't revealed. The victim seemed to have undergone a similarly horrific treatment to that suffered by Stephanie. Following a dispute in early February of 2020, she tried to jump out of Peter's car, but he caught her by the coat and dragged her down the road as she was hanging out the passenger door. Upon examining the victim's road rash injuries, the authorities discovered several others that seemed to have occurred recently. The woman claimed that weeks prior, Peter had tied her to a chair for 2 days and whipped her with belts. She was also repeatedly punched in the torso and not allowed to eat, drink, or go to the bathroom during that time. Other instances of abuse perpetrated by Peter involved punishing the woman by forcing her to kneel in the corner, pinching her fingers with pliers, or choking her to the verge of unconsciousness with a pillowcase. The 45-year-old reportedly threatened to kill her entire family if she left him. The authorities were baffled by the abuse, and referring to the victim, Chief Deputy Ross Mellinger told a media outlet, "The mind can't wrap itself around the barbaric nature of what she went through." Number 4. Glennis Downey. Leading up to September of 2021, Englishwoman Glennis Downey, aged 65, had tormented her husband for years in what a judge would later describe as a relationship of utter domination. Their marriage had been deteriorating for some time before Downey ramped up her abuse in 2019. That year, she forbade her husband, who was in his mid-60s, from seeing friends or family. The abuse continued until the man reported her to the police in 2021, and Downey was arrested and charged with controlling and coercive behavior. During the trial that followed, the extent of Downey's horrific behavior towards her spouse was revealed. The couple lived in Swanwick, Hampshire, and Downey constantly humiliated her husband and degraded him, particularly over his cleanliness. The man reported that he lived in constant fear of Downey's violent outbursts that typically involved her punching and kicking him. Her behavior was deemed to have had elements of school-ground bullying, as she would pull her husband's hair or poke him with knives. The woman then taunted him for being fearful of her and refusing to fight back, which she cited as evidence of his unworthiness, calling him half a man. The couple's daughters both testified against Downey during her trial. She was found guilty by a jury at Portsmouth Crown Court in the fall of 2022 and jailed for 2 years, in addition to being handed an indefinite restraining order. Number 3. Husband of Bibi Aisha. Born Aisha Mohammedzi, Bibi Aisha was featured on the cover of Time magazine in August of 2010 with the horrific injuries she had suffered while trying to escape an arranged marriage in her native Afghanistan. The woman had been mutilated by her husband, who cut off her nose and ears. The caption accompanying the photo was, "What happens if we leave Afghanistan?" The cover generated immense international controversy, sparking debates about the consequences of the Afghan war. When she was in her early teens, Aisha was married off to a Taliban fighter by her family as payment for a debt. She was relentlessly abused by her husband and his family, who reportedly forced her to sleep in the stable with the animals. When she was 18 years old, Aisha attempted to flee. She was caught by local police and imprisoned for several months, after which she was released to her father, who in turn took her back to her husband. As punishment for her escape attempt, the man and several accomplices took Aisha to the mountains. As the others held the teen down, her husband severed her nose and ears before leaving her for dead. Aisha mustered enough strength to crawl to her grandfather's house, and her relatives took her to a US military base, from which she ultimately reached the US. She arrived in California in 2010 and was set to receive free reconstructive surgery, but the torment that she'd suffered had wrought havoc on her mental health. The trauma had left her with seizures, panic attacks, and borderline personality disorder. Once her condition was stabilized through therapy and medication, preparations began in 2012 to rebuild her face. Doctors placed a silicone shell under her forehead that expanded the tissue they'd use in the reconstruction of her nose, along with tissue and cartilage from her forearm and hand. Aisha was adopted by an Afghan-American couple, moved to Maryland, and began studying to become a police officer. In late June of 2023, she was featured on the cover of Ariana magazine, and the photo displayed the changes to her face that had occurred following 12 completed surgeries. The woman was described on the cover as the symbol of hope, strength, and courage. Number 2. Aaron Uchitel. In late June of 2016, Fawn Ortega went to check on her daughter Prosper at the latter's home in Atlanta, Georgia, after suspecting that her husband was isolating her. Upon reaching the residence, Fawn was met by the husband, Aaron Uchitel, who denied her entry. Fawn was able to fight her way inside, found Prosper and saw that her face was swollen beyond recognition. The woman called the police, who arrived at the scene and arrested Aaron. It would emerge that for several days the man had tortured, assaulted, and abused his wife, who'd recently given birth. Aaron had reportedly told her, "I'm going to make it so where nobody will ever want you again." As he beat her relentlessly and cut up her hair, he repeatedly punched Prosper in the area of her eyes, breaking her orbital bones so that she wouldn't be able to see her baby boy, Ari, who was less than 2 weeks old. Aaron also poured scalding water into the 23-year-old mother's ears so that she couldn't hear her child's cries. At one point during the onslaught, Prosper had tried to escape through a bedroom window, but Aaron pulled her back and continued assaulting her throughout the beating that nearly ended her life. Aaron also repeatedly forced himself on his wife. In the aftermath of Aaron's arrest, Prosper began recovering in a local hospital. In early July, she partially regained her vision and was able to see her son again, a moment which was captured by her family members in a clip later picked up by news outlets. In just 2 days, a GoFundMe raised $94,000 of the $100,000 goal that would go towards the medical procedures as well as the physical and mental therapy Prosper would have to undergo. Number 1. Phillip Edward Bowers. On November the 20th of 2020, Texas man Phillip Edward Bowers was sentenced to 30 years in prison after he'd pleaded guilty to beating and torturing his wife. The incident was traced back to the spring of 2019, when Montgomery County Hospital District services were called to a home in New Caney. Responding units found Bowers' wife alone in a back bedroom, clinging to life after she'd been assaulted for days. Neighbors told the police that they'd seen Bowers and the couple's 3 children leaving the residence shortly before the arrival of paramedics. The unnamed victim recovered following life-saving treatment and reconstructive surgeries, and she was released into the care of family members after 2 weeks. One of the detectives working the case described the incident as absolutely the worst assault he'd ever investigated. Prosecutor Echo Hudson claimed that murder victims had fewer injuries on them than the woman, noting, "The things that happened in that house are the things of which horror movies are made." For a period of 3 days while their children were present in the house, Bowers tortured his wife, inflicting devastating damage. In his campaign of violence, he used items that included steel-toed boots, a large flashlight, a box cutter, and a vinyl jump rope. Shortly after the attack, Bowers was tracked down and arrested at a convenience store. He was given his decades-long sentence after admitting 1 charge of aggravated assault causing serious bodily injury with a deadly weapon, 1 charge of family violence, and 1 charge of aggravated kidnapping. Thanks for watching. Would you rather be able to turn into any animal you wanted or have superhuman strength? Let us know in the comments section below.